Looking for me? Oh, I didn't make you jump, did I?
No, of course not. I didn't quite know who it was.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for our show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Brett Summerell, who is the Director Research and Chief Botanist at the Royal Botanic Garden, Sydney. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you, Scott.
All right, so thank you again for joining early your time. I believe, looking at your bio, when you were an undergrad, you won the university medal as a top-ranked student that year. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I went to the University of Sydney. I studied agricultural science. It was not necessarily something I thought I'd ever end up in. I wasn't raised on a farm or anything like that, but I did live in the country for long periods of time in New South Wales and in Victoria. And I just had a real interest in farming, in agriculture, and in looking at ways in which crops could be sustainable, and also the importance of plants and crops for feeding humans. So it's something that I developed a real passion for over the years, and perhaps surprised myself that I went as well as I did.
Well, you've, of course, since then continued, and you've been a prolific scholar and have over 150 journal articles to your name. Specifically, one of those areas that you cover or research is in the area of fungi. Can you tell us why that area is so important for you?
So at the end of, in the last couple of years of my undergraduate degree, I was introduced to the study of plant pathology, which is basically plant diseases. And most of the really important diseases that cause the plants get are caused by fungi. So I developed an interest in the types of fungi that cause these diseases, why they were causing these diseases, and how you could go around mitigating, controlling them, manage them in different ways. And that was my introduction into the world of fungi. And fortunately, as I've developed my career at the Royal Botanic Garden, I had a much broader remit than just studying agricultural pests. The gardens themselves grow over 19,000 different species of plants. So if you put it in the context of a doctor, I've got 19,000 different species to try and work out what their pests and diseases are. And so that broadened my range enormously, and also gave me a lot of opportunities to get out into the more natural ecosystems, and the diversity of fungi in those areas is just amazing. So from that point in time, I've been very focused on understanding the diversity of fungi, describing new species, but also working out ways to mitigate their impact and try and understand what they do positively, and also try and manage what they do negatively.
So, can you get a little bit more granular in terms of the effects to food crops and native plants? How does it exactly work, and what are some of the root causes that has harmful effects both to that plant as well as the ecosystem?
So, in a cropping situation, as I think anybody who's tried to grow a vegetable garden at home, they'll know that there are a range of things that work against you to try and produce the perfect product, whether it's a tomato or whether it's a wheat crop. So there's a range of different fungi that cause these problems. Some of them will attack the roots of the plant, stop the water moving up into the plant. Others, like wheat rust, and those will infect the leaves, cause spots, and as such reduce the ability of the plant to photosynthesize. And then there are a whole range of different species which will attack the flowers and the fruit or the grain. Some of those can just rot the material, but others produce toxins that can be harmful both to the plant, but also to anything that actually tries to eat that plant material. So it could be a toxin that affects livestock, or it could be a toxin that affects the way in which we try to keep the plant material or in fact consume it. So there's a whole diversity of ways in which these types of organisms can have a negative impact on plants, and that's just not confined to the cropping systems that we look at. It also occurs in nature. So there's different fungi that are part of the natural cycle of the way in which plants grow in the natural ecosystem, but there's also a range of invasive species that humans, through our movements around the globe, have moved from one continent to another continent. And of course, when those different fungi come into those sorts of ecosystems, the plants have no natural adaptation, no evolutionary adaptation to be able to prevent those diseases happen. So that's when we can start to see some real big problems in the natural ecosystem as well.
Can you explain a little bit about the kind of environment that it thrives in, as well as how it propagates and spreads?
And there are a myriad of different ways in which that happens. Generally, we think of fungi as creatures, organisms that like moist, warmer conditions, and generally that's the situation. They're like all organisms; they thrive on the presence of water, and so when we see high periods of rainfall or intermittent periods of rainfall, we'll see these diseases become problematic. So in those sorts of situations, it can be that can be when we start to see problems. Sort of counterintuitively, they can also cause problems when the plants are stressed. So infection may happen in a period of moist weather, but as the plant becomes stressed, whether it's through drought or other factors, then a root system might not be as functional as it could be because of the activities of these organisms, or the movement of water up through the stem of the plant may be hindered. So you can start to see problems in those sorts of circumstances. And how they move around is a whole range of different methods. Some are easily air dispersed. So there are good documented examples of rust fungi moving from South Africa across to Western Australia, so blown right across the Indian Ocean. And we have a disease in our natural ecosystems at the moment, myrtle rust, which we have documented has moved from Eastern Australia across to Lord Howe Island and then into New Zealand. So in those sort of circumstances, very difficult to control. There are other organisms that we see around that are soil-borne, and quite often what we've experienced is when bushwalkers have walked into an area, they may have these tiny spores attached to their hiking boots or whatever, and in those sort of circumstances we can see the pathogen being moved around that way. So a number of different ways, and with the Wallamai pine, one of our classic new species that we've described over the last 20 years, we have a great example where bushwalkers have illegally gone into the natural site, but unfortunately on their boots was a really deadly pathogen, which is impacting upon the actual natural ecosystem of this particular special plant.
Now, speaking of dangerous pathogen, one of that is, I believe, is called Fusarium. Why is that dangerous, and how does that affect the plant or the host?
So Fusarium has been the main group of fungi that I've focused on in terms of my academic work, both here and all over the world. It's a micro fungi, so normally you wouldn't be able to see it, but it pretty much attacks everything that's green in terms of the number of host plants and host species that it affects. So it causes diseases like head scab and head blight, which people in right across the wheat belt in North America would be very familiar with. It causes toxins in corn and in a number of other crops. It causes wilt diseases, and the banana-geddon that we see at the moment, people talk a lot about how the Cavendish banana is particularly susceptible to this new strain of Fusarium that's slowly moving through Asia, Africa, and recently getting into a number of countries, well, a couple of countries in South America, and impacting the global supply of Cavendish bananas, blocks the vascular system, the water-moving system of the plant, so that the plant eventually dies because it's unable to extract moisture from the soil. So there's a number of ways in which it can impact that. It also produces a number of quite nasty toxins that can impact on horse production if it's in corn, and pig production, and in particularly in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, it can infect grain, sorghum and corn in those sorts of parts of the world, and if untreated properly and not managed properly, is responsible for high incidences of esophageal and digestive system cancers. And so that's a particular problem. And it's also a problem in people who are immunocompromised, because if they get infection with this particular group of fungi, it can be more often than not, it can be a lethal combination, because there really are no good chemicals for control of this particular group of fungi.
I mean, the way you explain it, it sounds frightening, to be honest with you. Let's put it in the context of climate change. So climate change, of course, is a general rise in temperature over a period of time. And some of that has some pretty unpredictable results. Not always the case that you would always have, let's say, more rain per se, more flooding. It depends on the region and parts of the world, but you can have things that are, I guess, somewhat unpredictable, or if it does happen, the frequency either happens more frequently or perhaps the intensity is greater. In that kind of context of climate change, where you could potentially have more moisture or drought situations, how does that further exacerbate these kinds of dangerous fungi? You may also like our quarterly Ask Dr. Perkins event that brings some of the most notable experts and category-leading startups in their area of sustainability and human survival on Earth and in space. To register, visit askdrperkins.com/events.
It's really complicated, and I think the unpredictability is the key thing here. Is that not being able to? I mean, weather is unpredictable at the best of times, but when you ramp it up to the level that we're seeing as a result of climatic changes, it does make it really, really difficult for growers, for farmers to predict what's going to happen in terms of the management of these sorts of pests and diseases. So it's really can be quite difficult in that sort of situation. Just turn that off. And so we often see that the different things will have different impacts on the different types of diseases. So with myrtle rust, this disease of natural ecosystems that I was talking about before, we're not necessarily, weather conditions are not necessarily seeing it being exacerbated as per se, but what we're seeing now after the bushfires that we had in, the devastating bushfires through Eastern Australia that we had a couple of years ago, with all of the new growth, the new flush of growth we've had in those areas, it's much more susceptible to the disease. So we're seeing impacts on particular species that we didn't see prior to the fires, because all of that flush of new growth has really promoted the disease and really causing problems for those particular species. So I think the unpredictability is the key issue there, and the way in which it works differently for different diseases. But certainly if you're seeing hotter, wetter weather over a period of time as a result of climate change, you can expect to see greater intensity and severity of these diseases. And if that's then followed by periods of stress because of dry weather as a result of climate change, then the impact is exacerbated greatly.
Now, for the listeners that are probably thinking, this doesn't really necessarily have a direct impact to them, but that's actually probably not true, because it has a direct impact to food safety as well as the ecology. And certainly if our plants and even the forests are susceptible to something like this on a large scale, that can have some huge implications. Can you elaborate on what are kind of the potential concerns that we should be looking out for?
I think the potential concerns are enormously complex and difficult, but they're, the things that you could expect is that if it becomes more difficult to grow particular crops in particular places, that there's maybe a movement of where you might cultivate particular plants. So we're seeing a movement in Australia for grape production to move to the south of the country. So the historical grape varieties in New South Wales, in the centre of the east coast of Australia, a lot of those are moving to Tasmania. So it's a huge impact on the growers and the farmers, and that of course is eventually has an impact on the consumer, because the price is obviously going to go up, and also probably the availability of particular varieties, particular types of wine that people like. Production impacts are always reflected in price, and availability. So if the environmental conditions are such that the price of a particular crop or plant is going to be increased, it's always a difficulty in terms of the producer. We're certainly seeing with these particular diseases that we're seeing in bananas now, it's reducing availability and the price of bananas in Australia, because not necessarily because the impact of the disease, which is exacerbated by these sorts of weather conditions, is necessarily, availability is not necessarily decreased, but the production system that they have to put in place to prevent the disease from moving around the banana growers means that the cost to the producer has been much greater, and also that the impact, that impact is then reflected in the price that the consumer pays. So, availability, price, and the different varieties that might have to be grown and the different tastes that we might have to get used to. So the impact is multiplied by all of those things that are happening.
And it's quite large scale impact, because again, you mentioned grapes and wine and certainly banana. That's a real concern. But we're also talking about coffee bean varietals, for example, or even cocoa beans for chocolate, and tomatoes, potatoes. I mean, everything can be potentially affected by this, right?
Everything, every plant species, and people sort of tend to, we have this condition, we talk about plant blindness. People tend to be perhaps ignorant of the importance of plants in their lives, and how it's really a critical factor, that they don't fully experience or fully understand that how many of your food products are dependent on plants. And even, even if it's beef in a feedlot, that's completely and utterly dependent on clean and healthy plants being supplied to the cattle to eat, and then for the product that you're going to eat. So everything is dependent on that. And of course, once you get out into the natural environment, into the ecological systems, obviously that has a huge impact on clean water, clean air, and also on carbon mitigation.
I wonder, over the years you've been researching, as well as what's projected, looking at kind of more of a predictive, forward-looking perspective, is the use of chemical pesticides, if that actually has taken an increase, and if you anticipate that the use of these harsh chemicals will actually have to increase even further because of just the unpredictable nature that you're referring to, as well as just a large-scale impact of these fungi.
I think the likelihood of that is mixed. I think there'll be different approaches in different places, and it also will depend on the resources of the particular country or wherever things are growing. You'll see in less well-resourced countries, there'll be probably a greater use of pesticides, different types of fungicides, insecticides, whatever, to control these types of increases in diseases and pests. But in a lot of the better resourced countries, there's definitely a movement away from the use of harsher pesticides, the use of more frequent use of pesticides, and looking at different options in terms of trying to produce the products that we have. The greater controls over residue levels, the greater controls over the types and nature of the pesticides that can be used. And I think that's definitely over the 30 years I've been working in this field, I've definitely seen a change in that space, in the ways in which that gets used. And I expect I think there's a greater understanding by consumers that this is likely to, and I think this is likely to continue in those particular areas. The concerns, I guess, will be in the less resourced countries and the options that they have to bring in some of these types of systems. That said, a lot of these systems can be more amenable to small scale grower initiatives, because they depend on that intensity of work and use. So sometimes they can be useful in those sorts of situations.
Now, we do quite a bit look at ag tech as well as food tech types of companies that have positive impact to climate action. And some of those startups are actually trying to tackle chemical or artificial pesticides or fertilizers by using microbiomes or bacteria that can have antimicrobial, antifungal properties, or other types of properties that are more beneficial. How do those work, and are they very effective in your opinion? Don't forget to visit astroperkins.com to register for our next quarterly events. Past and current speakers include Damian Vaughn, former NFL player, Neil Gregory, Chief Thought Leadership Officer at the IFC World Bank, and many more. To register, visit astroperkins.com and click on Events.
I think there's enormous potential in work in this area. I think the thing we have to be cognizant of and have to be careful with is that some of these is recognizing that the complexity of microbiome systems is enormous, and being able to just manipulate one particular microbial component of that microbiome may not necessarily give you the results that you may expecting. So I think we're still in the beginning phases of completely understanding agricultural and ecological microbiomes and how they work, and how they function, how they fluctuate, and the different roles of all of the different organisms that are involved in that. So we need to be quite careful about some of the claims and some of the expectations of manipulating that. But that said, I think better understanding of microbiome and the way in which the technology is adapting and allowing us to understand and predict and monitor the changes will provide an opportunity for us to be able to better manipulate, work out which are the key things and what are the interactions and the ways in which they work, in order to be able to get better control of these systems. But certainly for diseases like even like Panama disease, banana disease I was talking about, there's a lot of interest in looking at microbiome activity in those sorts of spaces. There's some great work happening in North Queensland at the moment, where they're looking at how different farming systems change the microbiome and how that might have an impact on the ability of the fungus to actually infect the plant, working in a competitive basis. So these microbiomes may be able to outcompete the pathogen, exclude it from infection, and then and through that process be able to provide some level of management and control. Particularly, we're in a race at the moment to develop new cultivars that might be more resistant to the disease, but we can't just go back to this panacea of we'll develop a new cultivar and that'll last. But because the fungus is the pathogen is really clever in terms of being able to evolve fast and overcome resistance over a period of time. We've been pretty lucky with Cavendish that it's lasted as long as it has, 50 years. So we need to understand microbiomes, understand how farming systems change microbiomes, and look at ways in which we can manipulate them so that we can get the outcomes that we want.
Wonderful. Now, at the Royal Botanic Garden of Sydney, you're doing some very interesting research as well as conservation efforts. And I believe a couple of those programs are called Plant Clinic as well as Australian Plant Bank. Are you able to speak to those, please? So
Plant Clinic is in my core area of interest, which is plant diseases and trying to manage and control those. So we run a commercial diagnostic service. So basically bring your plant into the plant doctors and we'll work out what's causing the problem, whether it's a disease, using a lot of, now it's just like COVID, I guess, in a ways, it's real-time PCRs, understanding the genetic signals of what we're getting to provide an answer to the client who's ever got the sick plant. So we're doing a lot of work in that space. There's a lot of efforts in urban greening and planting trees in our urban environments because of the benefits that trees have in terms of mental health and in climate change and climate mitigation, and just in having a nice environment. And we want to make sure that we are able to say that those plants are healthy, clean, and are more likely to sustain in that space. At the Australian Plant Bank, the focus there is on seeds, native seeds, and we've seen, particularly after the bushfires, it's really highlighted the importance of seed banking and making sure that we've got germplasm protected in a safe place so that we can, if we need to, if a disaster happens, we can go back to the seed bank, pull out the seeds, propagate the plant up, and then hopefully reintroduce it back into the wild. We've got a strong focus in that program on understanding particularly those species which are known and documented to be at threat. So we do a lot of work in that space to make sure that we have a good seed collections, use the genetics and the genomics to make sure that as a backup to make sure that we've got a genetically representative sample of those seeds, so that we're not losing particular genes if we're just collecting from a limited stock. So it's a really critically important program. We're certainly at in the moment looking to propagate up a number of threatened species to replenish or add to the stock in the wild, so that some of these species are less at threat. Some of the problems that you have in that sort of situation is that quite often some of the particularly rainforest species which are at threat from some diseases are less able to be stored because they have fleshy seeds that are used to being going through the digestive system of a bird and dispersed that way. So there's a lot of work in terms of cryopreservation and using that sort of technology to be able to store them long term.
It's important work, without a doubt. And I'm sure you're probably collaborating with, is it the Arctic Seed Vault as well?
Yeah, with a whole bunch of seed banks all around the world. So there's a program called the Millennium Seed Banking Program. The focus for native seeds is the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, our sister organisation in London. But there's seed banks in pretty much every country in the world now. I think all around the world, and a really important program to conserve native species in all different environments right across the world.
My final question is, you've mentioned a couple of times, is the impact of different countries' wealth and their ability to have certain processes, capabilities to fend off some of these diseases. For the least developed countries, whether that's in Africa, Southeast Asia, or whatnot, any advice or suggestions in terms of how they can actually mitigate some of these risks and be able to have reasonable food safety?
It really, training is so critically important. We've worked a lot, particularly in Southeast Asia, in countries in terms of building up some core expertise and assisting to build up labs. You don't need the flashiest and most amazing lab in order to be able to do really good work to help farmers in communities like that. Working in P&G to get make chocolate production a bit more sustainable, because it has such an important impact on the community health and individual farmers' personal health and the like. So it's really important to work in those places, to train, to collaborate, and to collaborate in a way which is beneficial in both directions. So that's you're not going in there just telling. It's really about understanding their systems, understanding the approaches that are taken, and helping to build up expertise, whether it's in plant pathology, plant disease control, or in seed banking. Really great programs in a number of countries all around the world to build up expertise in seed banking and with low tech solutions, really making an impact in those sorts of ecosystems.
Well, this has been a very important and relevant discussion today, and I've been joined by Dr. Brad Summerell, who is the Director Research and Chief Botanist at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Sydney. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.